Good Saturday morning to you. This is Matthew study number 59. As you can see, I am outside one more time. Although it does occur to me that there are many of you who listen to this as an audio podcast, and so honestly, you really could care less where I am at. But hopefully the sound is good and you can hear it no matter what. I'm glad to visit with you today. Just again, as a real quick note, we won't have a Bible study tomorrow on Sunday. We're going to continue our sermon series tomorrow morning on mad church disease. So if you're anywhere near Mansfield, you definitely want to come here and be part of this. But today, and then back again on Monday, we're going to look at our Matthew study. And today we're going to wrap up Matthew chapter 4. We're looking at these last 3 verses in the chapter, so let me just read them real quick for you. And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Now again, without repeating everything that we've been talking about these last few days, I've shared with you that I think that this is a setup for what's to come in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 9. It's the pattern. We talked a few days ago about the fact that Jesus is preaching and teaching, and then the last couple of days that he is affirming what he is saying by the works that he does. And this actually becomes a pattern. We see Matthew 5 through 7 being his teaching, and then Matthew 8 and 9 being the works that he does. And this is really an introduction to all of that. Yesterday we talked about the completeness of the healing that Jesus did. I mean, never before was there anyone who did what Jesus did, and never again will there be until heaven is indeed here on earth and everything is restored to the way it should be. That really is what Jesus is all about, right? I mean, he's saying, behold, this is the good news. Watch out, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he, as the Son of God, is bringing that kingdom of heaven to us. Now, the result of the teaching and the preaching and the healing is that people were paying attention, and great crowds followed him. I want to give, again, just some idea of how significant this really was. Again, you might just read through these words real quick in verse 25 and not give a lot of attention to them, but I think it's important that we note this. First of all, we see multiple times here at the very beginning in verse 23 and again in verse 25 that this is happening throughout all of Galilee. This idea of Galilee is an area, a region that's about 50 or 60 miles long and 25 to 30 miles wide. And Jesus is going throughout all of Galilee to multiple cities performing these works and preaching this good news. And the result is that people are getting word. I mean, you know, they don't need the telephones and the mobile phones and the internet. When there's someone who brings heaven to earth, when literally the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and people who have had illness from the time they were born, people who were paralyzed can now walk, people who are blind can now see, people who couldn't hear before can hear, people who had demons have the demons thrown out of them. It just didn't matter. Jesus healed them. And so, you know, if you know there is a possibility of real, authentic healing, you're going to do everything you can to get it. You know, one of the words that's used here is that people who were in pain. I mean, when you are in pain, you'll do almost anything to get out of pain. And that's what we see happening here. And the description tells us that people followed him. They followed him for their own healing. They followed him just because, honestly, they wanted to see what was happening. They wanted to see other people really be healed. And they followed him from, and get these words, from Galilee. Now remember, Galilee is kind of a mixture, right? I mean, it's a Jewish region, but it has a lot of Gentiles in it, as we learned last week. So people followed him from all over Galilee. And then they came from the Decapolis. Now, again, without a little bit of study, you don't know what the Decapolis is, but the Deca is a word for 10, and polis is a word for city. It really means the 10 cities, and this is really 10 Gentile or Greek cities, mostly east of the Jordan. So really from another region altogether, people heard about Jesus in these 10 different Greek cities east of the Jordan, and they crossed the river to get to where the healing was. They came up from Jerusalem and Judea. Now again, Jerusalem is the center of Jewish life and the Jewish faith, and everybody in Jerusalem, unless you happen to be a Roman who had to be there, everyone in Jerusalem is Jewish, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether you were Greek, Gentile, Jewish, Hebrew. All it mattered was that here's someone who was bringing heaven to earth, and he could heal. And if you had illness, you wanted what he had, and you came. Again, religion, faith, race, gender, none of it mattered. If you could get healed, you went there. So they came from Galilee, they came from the Decapolis, they came from Jerusalem and Judea, and even from beyond the Jordan. Now, again, the Jordan is the river that flows on the east side of everything that we know to be Judea and Galilee and Samaria. And really beyond the Jordan is just kind of another expression of saying, well, from the rest of the world. I don't know if you've ever been to Manhattan or not, but I remember when many, many years ago when I was training at Merrill Lynch, there was a poster that I saw in somebody's office that basically said there's Manhattan and then there's the rest of the world. It's kind of a New York City central inside joke. But this is kind of the idea of what we see here in this passage. All of the world that they knew and that they cared about was in Jerusalem and Judea, and was always on the west side of the Jordan River. So if you said even people were coming from beyond the Jordan, that meant that people were coming from long ways away that heard about this Jesus, that heard about the kingdom of heaven. Now, how do we wrap this up and how do we apply it to our life? Can I say to you that it didn't matter whether it was 2,000 years ago or whether it's today? If you know that there is evidence that the kingdom of heaven is invading earth, then I think you want to get all of it that you can. And while we don't have the choice today to cross the Jordan River to follow the physical in the flesh form of Jesus today, we certainly still do have the choice to follow him. And we do it through the Bible, through our prayer life. We do it through getting together with other Christ followers. We certainly do it through communion and the Eucharist. And I would just submit to you today that as you meditate on these verses, that you ask yourself, am I following Jesus the best that I know how? I hope that those are good words for you this Saturday. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you again in the sermon tomorrow morning.